Hi, okay, so the whole video that you're about to watch is going to be, like it says on the screen, a guidance on the IA for IB philosophy. Now, this should take you through everything that you need to know. It should take you through the marking as well. So, like, obviously, when we're writing the IA, you should be thinking about what is the examiner looking for. So, I'm going to go through the criteria by which it's marked. I'm going to go through what that means as well, like what does the criteria mean, because there might be language in the criteria that you're unfamiliar with and you're not entirely sure actually what the examiner is looking for. So I'll go through the criteria that you need to be aware of when you're writing your IA. I'll go through things like tips for success. I'll go through things like structure. What structure can you follow? What should it include, or what should the examiner or whoever see in your IA? I'll be going through also. I'll be looking at example templates that we have, and how the structure that is in that template should guide you upon what you should be writing about, or upon how you should go about your writing. And I'm going to give you an example as well. So I've got a last year's year 13 who's left now. I'm going to give you the example that of their work, and there's quite a good example to look at because it ticks quite a lot of the boxes of the criteria, so it's giving you a good idea about the top bands and the criteria. As if I've discussed that is looking for or what it means, then hopefully you're going to see an example of exactly what that looks like in reality and practice. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at throughout this video. So just says there pretty much a repetition of what we're going to be covering. The 5 criteria which is marked by, how the start of your IA should look and sound, how the link between the stimulus introduction and the philosopher or philosophers you are to then spend the rest of your IA discussing, how to ensure you cover your chosen philosophy for discussion well, hitting the criteria by which it's marked, how to incorporate your research on primary and secondary sources, and what these actually are, because you might not know, which I didn't know when I was in sixth form sort of thing, so you might not know either. So it's just to clarify what they are and how you can incorporate them. How to reference your sources as you go along. Bit of a boring thing to do, but it's an academic must. How to transition from covering the philosophy and philosophers or philosopher to evaluating the ideas, again hitting the criteria by which it is marked, and how to conclude your IA and bring it back to the stimulus, which of course your IA is focused on. And I'll go through also what exactly the IA is and what a stimulus is. So here we are. What is the IA? So the IA stands for 2 words: internal assessment. Internal meaning it is marked by the school which you're doing the IA with, and assessment it's something that we judge your ability by. Okay, and it's worth 25% of your marks at standard level. If you were doing higher level, it would be worth 20%, but none of us, because of the COVID situation, I think none of us are going to be entering the higher level because we're not going to have time to cover it to the extent we would like to cover it, to give you a good chance. So we're going to be probably covering the standard level. Okay, so keep in mind that it's 25% of your marks. Paper 2, 25% also, and the paper 1 core is worth 50%, and that's where all your marks come from for the whole IB philosophy course. This means you'll be completing an essay that is assessed internally, like I've already said. That'll be by us in the school, and then it's sent away and it's verified by somebody else. So I can't just say you all get grade 7, you're all great students and stuff. Off you go, bugger off. I can't do that. It'll go to somewhere else across the world, and they will check that my judgments about you, and my judgments about your academic ability are correct. So I have to be, robust and strict, and so does your teachers, other teachers as well, in order for that verification externally to match up with what I've said or what your teachers have said. Okay, it's a chance for you to delve into university style writing. It's very, very good preparation for university, I feel, because it mimics a lot of what you actually do at university. It's research by yourself. It helps you do that to grow understanding of a topic. That's an essential skill to do, especially when you get to university, when you're just given a module and you have a couple of lectures on it, or several 4, 5, 6 lectures on something, and then you have to go away and research it. Being able to research on your own is quite an important skill that you'll need at that point in your life, and doing it now is quite good preparation for that. Search, collect, and use sources to support your understanding. Again, that's something that you don't do in the younger years, you haven't done so far, but it's something that you need to be introduced to now, because again, that is something that's going to be expected of you at university. So it's a very good skill set to get under your collar as well. Act like an academic, researching, thinking, critiquing, and drawing conclusions about a topic. Before, earlier in education, you've been focused on just like understanding ideas, and you've just been like communicating your understanding of that idea, and it's been, learning baby steps sort of thing. And now we're sort of really picking up the pace, and you're becoming more like an academic. Obviously, we're doing a rather adult course. So we're treating you more like an adult, and so does the specifications of the course. It treats you like an adult, so you're preparing more for that very adult way of going about your learning and going about education. Okay. So just to summarize the needs of the IA, what you have to do. So your IA is a philosophical analysis of a non-philosophical stimulus. A stimulus is anything that provokes thought, discussion, evokes a question, raises an issue, anything like that. And it could be anything. It could be an image, it could be an extract from a book or from a song, it could be an advert, it could be a product, it could be like just something like a picture or something, or I don't know, something that's been created, for commercial use that you think, okay, well that could raise a philosophical question, anything like that at all. Okay, so a non-philosophical stimulus. An extract from a philosopher's book, that is not a non-philosophical stimulus, that is a philosophical stimulus, so it has to be an extract. If it is to be an extract from a text, it would have to be something that's non-philosophical, maybe a piece of fiction, maybe a poem, maybe, like I said before, like an advert or something like that. It could be one line from an advert, maybe. Okay, it must be between 1,900 and 2,100 words. Now the specification says 2,000 words, however you can go slightly under or over as far as I'm aware. So, 1,900 is probably the least. I think lower than that, and you need to bump it up. 2,100 is probably the most, and I think if you're going over that, then you're in you need to cut it down and be more concise with what you're saying in your text. So between those two limitations, this will be covered in 3 main areas. Now I'm going to cover 5 because the 2 main areas that I'm going to touch on in a minute of the 3 require more understanding and more detail. Okay. So first of all, you need to outline the issue which the stimulus raises and what philosophical ideas or ideas it links to. And that's roughly around 200 words. It doesn't have to be. It could be 300, could be 150. It depends on the person writing the IA. It depends on their idea and how they're conveying their idea. So, it's a rough estimate. If you're spending 600 words on that outline, that's far too much. If you're spending 50 words, that's far too little. So round about 200 is what you're looking for. An explanation of that philosophical idea, who came up with it, why, have others developed it, supported it, and etc., etc. Again, round about 800 words, sorry. But again, that's an estimate. If you're focusing that around about 600, 700 words, not terrible. If you're focusing it around 900 words, not terrible either. But if you're spending 1,200 words, or if you're spending 400 words on that area, then perhaps you're not setting yourself up very well to hit the criteria of success that I'm going to outline later down in the video as well. And an analysis and an evaluation of that philosophical idea. What are the critiques of it? What are the benefits of it? Are there alternative ideas that better help with the issue and the stimulus, and so on and so on? And that's the bulk of our IA. That's where I've underlined those 2 words, the analysis and the evaluation, come in, and they are, as I'm going to come to the criteria of success later, they are the areas where you're going to get the most marks from. So it's really, really important that you spend most of your IA analysing the ideas, or the idea that your stimulus evokes and the ideas around it, and you evaluate them, you judge. I'm going to come to evaluation and what it means more later down the line, but evaluation in a nutshell, you're coming to judge just how credible those ideas are, how valuable, how valid, how useful, how agreeable, are those ideas which you put forward, and then you're comparing and contrasting them to come to a conclusion of your own. And again, I'll come to how to go about your conclusion later in the video as well. Okay, so I'll start with the first bit. What are the 5 criteria which it is marked by? So how will it be assessed? The first criteria I'm going to look at is in front of you. It says identification of issue and justification. Now it's only worth 3 marks. I should highlight in total it's worth 25 marks. So it's 3 out of 25. Okay, not very much at all. However, it's still an easy place to lose marks. You know, it's an easy place to gain marks, but I think it's an easy place to lose marks as well in that same vein. So I've highlighted the top band box, even though it's at the bottom, it's the top band. So as you can see, 3 marks. The philosophical issue raised by the stimulus is clearly and explicitly identified. There is a clear justification of the connection, as in explanation, of the connection between the stimulus and the philosophical issue identified. So basically, you are clearly talking about your stimulus. What is it? What does it show me? And you're clearly linking it to the philosophical issue that is evoked by that image or by that text or by whatever the stimulus is. Okay, clarity is another criteria with 4 marks. This occurs throughout your whole IA, from the very first word to the last word. It has to be clear. And again, the top band, the response is well structured, focused, and effectively organized. The response is clear and coherent. So like I was saying before, there's going to be a structure that I've put forward as a suggestion. You don't have to follow that structure, but it's, again, you know, if we're looking for the criteria of clarity, we're looking for, the examiner's looking for a well-structured, focused, and effectively organized IA, then it's important that it does flow, and it does, if it's a progressive piece. If you're, you know, you should be, you know, it should be very easy for the reader to understand exactly the journey that you're taking in your thinking. Do you know what I mean? And that's it's an important criteria to be aware of. And again, like I say, it lasts throughout the IA, not just in any particular part. Criteria C, knowledge and understanding. Again, it's like A. I think it's a very easy one to hit, but it's also an easy one to lose marks on as well. Just know your stuff. Know whatever you're talking about. The response contains relevant, accurate, and detailed knowledge. There is a well-developed explanation of the philosophical issue. There is appropriate use of philosophical vocabulary throughout the response. So that first part, the response contains relevant, accurate, and detailed knowledge. All you need to do, basically, is if you're talking about a philosopher, make sure you talk about their ideas correctly. If you're talking about Jean-Paul Sartre and existentialism, make sure your explanations of existentialism are correct. If you're talking about Karl Marx and his philosophical ideas and his economic ideas or his ideas on religion or such, make sure whatever you're saying is accurate as to what Marx actually said. Okay, if you're talking about Emile Durkheim as a critique of what Marx is saying, say on religion, he's saying religion is not useful for society. It's, you know, it's an illusionary sun. And you're saying Emile Durkheim actually comes in later down the line in life and says actually religion is very useful for society. And, you know, again, you need to make sure that whatever you're saying about Durkheim as well is accurate, because if you're showing that you don't understand Marx, you don't understand Durkheim, or you don't understand, you know, the ideas that they put forward, or you use the terminology incorrectly, yeah, if you're talking about Marx, calling him a capitalist, you know, that would be a big fatal error. Obviously, he's not a capitalist. He never was. He was actually very anti-capitalist, if you know Marx at all. So, you know, using terminology well, using it correctly, making sure you know the terminology. You know, there's plenty of key terms that you need to be aware of as well. So it's important that you keep those in mind. It might be a case that when you're doing your research and you're reading up on things, and if you see in a video you're watching, or in an extract that you're reading, or an article you're reading, or whatever, you see a word that you think, okay, that's something I'm going to need to know, or I'm going to need to, I could use myself. You make a record of that, write it down somewhere, or, you know, anything to help you remember. Okay. The next criteria, second to last one, and this is where the marks are more significant. So your analysis, and like I was saying before, these last 2 sections are where, you know, are the ones that are going to take the most of your you know, the words of your IA. This is what most of your words are going to be focused on these 2 parts. So analysis, the bottom, well, the top band, says the response contains well-developed critical analysis. The examples used are well chosen and lend support to the argument. Counter-arguments are identified and analysed in a convincing way. So the first part contains well-developed critical analysis. So the knowledge and understanding is you, from the criteria earlier, is that you have demonstrated that you understand the philosophy or the philosophical idea linked to the issue raised by the stimulus. And your critical analysis is you looking at other suggested ideas and philosophical sort of, you know, thoughts on it, and looking at what people have said about the key idea you're looking at, who has critiqued the idea, who has supported the idea, who has developed the idea, and who has offered an alternative idea, and is that alternative idea one that's more sensible, one that answers the question better, one that is less convoluted, one that is more evidence-based. And by evidence, I don't just mean like physical evidence, I mean also like reasoning. Is it a more rational argument they put forward than the one that you've initially started to talk about? That analysis, that ability to deconstruct the idea and to judge it well and say, actually, well, this is why it's a good idea, or this is why it's not a good idea, this is why it's a strong idea, or this is why it's not, this is why it's sensible, this is why it's helpful or not. That's really key. The examples used are well chosen and lend support to the argument. So, like I was saying before with Marx, if you're talking about Marx and then you link in somebody who has nothing to do with Marx and nothing to do with the ideas of Marx, that's not a very well chosen person to bring in. Durkheim could be, would be quite a good person to bring in, because he talks about the religion and society and how the two can go really well together. Whereas bringing in Plato, about Marx and religion and such, might not be very good unless you've done a lot of research and looked at Plato. I can't recall anything on Plato that would be very particularly useful in that instance. So I wouldn't personally bring in Plato when I'm talking about Marx and I'm trying to evaluate or analyze, I should say, the ideas of Marx. Okay, and again, where it says at the bottom, the last sentence, counter arguments are identified and analysed in a convincing way. All that means really is that when you're talking about a counter argument, you identified it correctly. You've said it. What you said is true, and analysed it in a convincing way. So you've actually explained why it's a counter argument. Why is it a possibility? Why could that answer to the question, or that suggestion for the issue that the stimulus raises, why could that be a valid one? And you offering that convincingly, it will get you the marks there. So like 8 marks it is. So out of 25, nearly a third of the marks. It's worth a lot. So it's throughout your text as well, throughout your IA. This criteria applies. So it's really something to be mindful of when it's coming down to rating it. Last criteria, evaluation, 6 marks. So again, the second to last one and the last one cumulatively, 14 marks out of 25. This is why I said that these two should be where the bulk of your IA is focused on, because it's over half the marks. So the criteria says there is clear, or for the top band criteria, there is clear evaluation of alternative interpretations or points of view. All or nearly all of the main points are justified. The response argues from a consistently held position. The conclusion is clearly stated and consistent with the argument. So the first part, all that's saying is that the ideas you've put across, you are evaluating them, you are judging them. What is the value in this idea? Does it make sense, or does it not? Do you think? Does it have strong evidence or substantial evidence that suggests, okay, yeah, it's a pretty valid argument? And then you compare it as well with other ones. Well, let's look at another idea, another alternative idea. Does that have any validity to it? Does that make sense? Does that make more sense than the original idea, and so on? And it's similar to analysis. However, you're casting your judgments. You're saying, well, I think this. Yeah. In the end, I've looked at all these things, I've analysed it, and this is what I'm saying. It's having that ability to put yourself out there and say, well, actually, this is what I think. And like it says, all and nearly all the main points are justified. So making sure that the points that you make sense, basically, are reasonable, are sensible points to make. The response argues from a consistently held position. So when you, as a writer, are saying, well, this is what I think, you're arguing from that point of view. You're not saying, well, this is what I think. However, I actually think in this. I could think this, and I could think that. That doesn't seem very structured. It doesn't seem very clear. If you have done your analysis properly, you should be able to go, okay, well, after my analysis, this is what I think, and this is why I think it. Okay, so that's your evaluation part. Okay, so how the start of your IA should look and sound, and how to link the issue raised in the stimulus to the philosophical idea to be discussed. The start of your IA. Your IA should start with a brief discussion of the stimulus. What is it? Who created it and why? What does it show? What is the meaning of it, or how is it interpreted? What issues, questions, thoughts does it raise to the receiver? They're your main questions. So there's the template that we use in Broad Green International. Just got the front cover, which is where you put your name and you put your candidate number, nothing special really. The contents page, you just, your chapters that you or the headings that you use, you can just put them in there so you can guide the reader to particular sections as they wish. And your stimulus is in there as well. So for the example I've used Imagine by John Lennon, and I've put the verses in there and the chorus from the song. So imagine that we're talking about that stimulus now. If you're not familiar with the stimulus, all you've got to do is imagine to yourself, well, what kind of themes are being raised by those lyrics? If you've ever heard the song, I'm sure you've heard the song. Everyone's heard the song. What's being raised? Is it what's it talking about? What is the problem that Lennon is making us think about through that song, or what are the problems? And then pinpoint that one problem and think about the philosophies that are linked to it, or the philosophical ideas that are linked to that problem or to that issue. So in our school we focus on the particularly I can't find the line now. Oh, it's the first line. Imagine there's no heaven. We focus on that primarily, and that's where we like I was saying before about Marx. That's where we bring in the philosophy of Marx. Karl Marx said that religion was not useful for society. It was actually counterproductive. He wanted a productive society, one that helped the workers and one that didn't allow for oppression to carry on the way it did for so long in history. And he wanted that obviously communist sort of proletariat revolution to happen, and religion was stood in the way of that for Marx. So you could be using that first line to, who was it? Well, there's a line written from John Lennon. It's it's a song that's been distributed around the world. Very, a lot of people can identify with it, and it's a very famous song for expressing the concern for religion, expressing the belief that actually religion is not very good for society. It gets in the way of peace, and that's where you could link in that Marx thought something quite similar. He thought that actually there can be no peace for the proletariat, for the workers of the world, so long as religion exists, and that's where you can establish that link. So that's an example you could use as one of the examples we use in our school. And there it is. There's an arrow. Yeah, just in case you weren't aware exactly what I was talking about. Okay. These are the sections that we have signed off in our template, and the first part is up here. Introduction, what is the philosophical issue? And again, it says there 200 words roughly. Outline what the stimulus shows us is from, what the philosophical issue that links to it, and then outline what you will be discussing, aiming to do in your essay. So again, very straightforward instructions, not a very long section at all. Those words there are roughly about 20, so imagine that section just about 10 times, well, 20 words, yeah, about 20-30 words. So just imagine that those 3 lines, about 9 more of them, and that's your section done. Maybe about 8 more, and it's done. So here's the example that I was talking about earlier of a very good IA. I'm not going to tell you the marks, I'm not going to tell you the grades, I'm certainly not going to tell you who it was, but I am going to tell you that it was a very good IA, and it's a very good example to learn from. So as you can see, there's the front page. There, I took all the name off and such. The contents page, that you can see where they have signified the sections are, and their stimulus is a image of what's the film? What's the series? Mr. Robot. Mr. Robot is a series, and it's a fan art from the series, which they've selected. And then that was their subject of discussion. I'll show you their introduction. So here's their introduction. Now, straight off the bat, the heading introduction indicates structure. So using headings is quite good, a good way to communicate that you're showing the examiner or the person who's looking at it that you have planned this, you've thought this through. Okay. First 2 points I want to make. See how it starts with what is it and who created. Created should be created. Ignore my spelling mistake. It's been a long day. So the very first line is the writer telling the reader what are they seeing. Okay. The second line is telling us more about what does it show us. What's the issue? So he's faced with the moral dilemma of either existing in drug-induced euphoria of ignorance, or revealing the truth of his dismantled society. To grasp the truth, he exposes and then it goes on a bit more about the context of the image. Eliot's steps were determined by a godlike figure. So it's using determined. So I'm going to give it away exactly what it's about. It's about free will and determinism. But using those terms earlier on help the reader understand. Okay, well, how is that? How is this image linked to free will? How is it linked to determinism? So that's how you need to do it. You need to follow the criteria that I listed earlier about what is the stimulus, who created it, what does it show, what's the meaning, and what can be interpreted. So towards the end of their introduction, that's where they say what issues or questions does it raise, and they raise the issue. As you can see from sort of the fifth line from the bottom, the philosophical issue raised from this is whether we have free will or are confined to determinism. That one short sentence clearly states what the issue is. If you remember the criteria, which I'm going to come to in a second, but now why not actually? So there's the criteria on the bottom right of the screen. The philosophical issue raised by the stimulus is clearly and explicitly identifiable. That one line, the philosophical issue raised from this is whether we have free will or are confined to determinism. That is a clear identification of the philosophical issue raised by the stimulus, because he's looking at an image that says control is an illusion. Yeah. Is he being controlled? Is he free? That's the question raised by the image, by him looking at the thing which he thinks might be controlling him. There is a clear justification of the connection between the stimulus and the philosophical issue. The writer for this IA has spent time telling the reader who Eliot is, the character in the picture, and what is the background to this image. Why has the person who created the art created this? What does it show, and why does it show that particular theme? And that's where the issues come from. So that's how they've done that, and that's roughly around about 200 words. Okay, so feel free to look at that as a good example of how to introduce your IA and how to make the link between the stimulus and the philosophical issue or question which your IA is going to begin to discuss. Okay. Just a final point before I do move on. Like I said earlier, clarity is something that runs right the way through your IA. The very first word to the very last word, it has to be clear. So that comes in a number of ways. That comes through obvious things that you've learned in earlier education: punctuation, grammar, spelling, syntax, all the things that are relevant. If you think of your English skills that are relevant to you communicating your ideas clearly and to be understood by others. A good way of gauging whether that is happening or not is to get someone else to read it. Get someone who might not be very familiar with philosophy, or even if they are, it doesn't really matter, but perhaps someone who's not familiar with philosophy, perhaps someone in the house with you, perhaps a friend, perhaps someone at school, someone you trust, just to have a little read over the sections that you create, and ask them to judge. Does that make sense to you? Do you understand that? Is there anything you could improve about that? And get them to look. That's a really handy way of doing it. Because if another person sometimes you read things to yourself and you think it makes perfect sense, but if you get somebody else to read it, they are very, very good at being able to be more critical for you and look and offer you suggestions for improvements that you would not have thought of on your own. So that's a very good way of gauging whether actually you are being clear in what you're saying or not. If you're not clear, it's likely you don't understand what the issue is, or you're not understanding the philosophy. If that's the case, you think, then it's worth perhaps just taking some time away from your IA to go and do a bit more research. If it's on free will and determinism, perhaps go and do a little bit more research on what free will is, what determinism is, what are the arguments for either, and what's the conflict between them and such. So that's for you to do, and that's for you to be honest about as well. Okay. So number 3, how to ensure you cover your chosen philosophy, and how to incorporate your research on primary and secondary sources, and how to reference as you go along. So the important question I said I'd raise earlier, or I'd answer earlier, is what is a primary and secondary source? A primary source is a quote or extract from a text of some sort. It could be a book, an article, a script, anything you want, and you are getting the original idea
in it from the person who said it or came up with it themselves. So, for example, if I'm quoting an idea of Karl Marx from his own book, Das Kapital, he's got many books, but that's the main one, then this would be a primary source as they are directly his words and it is his idea. Okay, so that's a primary source. It's coming from the person who said it themselves. Okay. A secondary source is a quote or an extract from a text or some sort, and the author is discussing an idea that they did not say or come up with, referring to someone else's ideas. So, thinking about your IA, your whole IA is pretty much going to be a secondary source because you're talking about another philosophical issue, or another philosophical idea. You know, it might be Karl Marx, it might be Jean-Paul Sartre on existentialism. It could be who else do we look at? We look at Plato and the nature of existence and knowledge itself. It could be, you know, if you're looking at him, then you know he is the creator of the idea about the theory of forms and such. So it's not a primary source that we're looking at. Our IA is. It's a secondary source because we're talking about that pre-existing idea of Plato's and the other people I mentioned as well. So, for example, if I'm quoting an article written by Jeremy Corbyn discussing an idea of, and even quoting Karl Marx himself, then this would be a secondary source, as the idea is not originally Corbyn's. Okay, so hopefully that makes a bit more sense. Not essential for your IA because you don't indicate anywhere in your work what a primary source is and what a secondary source is, but it is worth making a note of. As an assessor, as an examiner, I imagine they are more expecting. If you're talking about for example, your central idea in your IA, you should be using a primary source. If primarily you're talking about the ideas of Marx, you should be using an extract from Marx's work to talk about what were Marx's ideas. If your IA is focused on, I know, for example, we focus on Aristotle and another one on his concept of eudaimonia. If that's your main focus, then again, you should be referring to the works of Aristotle. They should be your primary sources. Not essential in your work, but I would strongly suggest that the central idea you discussed in your IA, the author of that idea, you refer to their works. Okay. The people who come later, who critique those ideas, who offer alternative ideas and such, not necessarily, but you definitely your core philosopher and their ideas, that they should be primary sources, which you take those ideas from and which you use in your text. So to link from your introduction to your discussion of the actual philosophical idea, comes in the second section. Now I've siphoned it off in our template here quite clearly, so we're assuming that's all about Marx. We're assuming the introduction has so think we link with Lenin again, John Lennon's Imagine again, from the earlier example. So if we imagine that's our stimulus and we've introduced the issue like I did before verbally, we would then go into talking about, well, what did Marx actually say about religion? What was his ideas? What was his ideas generally? How does that fit into Marx's general philosophy? And that's where that would happen. So again, it says there's 600 words roughly. Again, like I said before, could be 500, could be 700. It's not, it's not creed, so don't aim for 600. Absolutely, but it's just a roundabout suggestion of what to aim for, and it gives you instructions there on what to do as well, in order to explore the ideas of Marx. I've put an arrow for references. That's because I'm going to come later to, well, not too later, soon in the near future. I'm going to come to how you keep on track with your sources as you do your research. How you keep on track with your sources, and how you don't end up quoting something and then not being able to reference it properly, because it's a pain in the backside and we don't want that to happen to anyone. So I've used the example again that I used earlier. It's the same example, and I'm going to point out the reasons why this example fits in the suggestions that I laid out earlier. So they start off their link from the introduction to the idea itself by talking about one of the suggested ideas to the stimulus. If you remember, the stimulus was the character of Elliot from Mr. Robot looking at a mask, and it says underneath him the control is, or beside him, control is an illusion. So it's alluding to the fact that we don't know if he's got free will. Is he choosing by his own volition to do the things he does, or is he being determined? Is he being manipulated? Is someone pulling the strings for him? And it's the same in life. Are we choosing our own actions? Are we free, or are we getting our strings pulled by society, by our biology, by genetics, by our psychology, and a number of things? So the person who's writing this has started off by just going through what exactly free will is, and they've picked a key philosopher on free will. So they picked Jean-Paul Sartre, and just give it a brief sort of summary of what he said about free will. Notice how I'm gonna just skip ahead a little bit where I've circled I've given the red circles. Notice how they've footnoted their sources. You don't have to do it this way. You can just put your sources at the end. However, I think this way looks much cleaner, and it's much clearer to the examiner exactly what the extract you've taken. Where has it come from? So we can see exactly that number 2 I've circled, that quote, "Man is responsible for what he is." We can see that has come from Jean-Paul Sartre's 1946 text, "Existentialism is a Humanism," and that is a primary source. So that gives the examiner, or the person reading anyway, it gives them a clear indication that you know what you're talking about, and that the idea that you've expressed is from the person itself. So, and it's verifiable. If I wanted to check, I could go and get 1946 "Existentialism is a Humanism" and check. In the references, there should be a page number. If not, it should be included in this case. Actually, I don't think there is a page number, but there should be. But that's never mind. And in which case, if the page number is in there, I should be able to pick up that book, that edition from 1946, go to that page and find that quote, and hopefully it's in there, and then, okay, yeah, it's verifiable, it's true. If looking at university sort of thing, if you misquote something, if you say Marx said "Man is responsible for what he is" in Das Kapital on page 4, and I open page 4 of Das Kapital and it's not in there, you can get in some quite serious trouble as an academic. It becomes plagiarism, which is basically cheating. So don't cheat. Actually, be true and get your resources genuinely by reading, by researching, by looking at articles, by picking up a book and flicking through it, sort of thing, and looking at the headings and thinking which one's relevant to you and reading through it, or looking at a video. However you get your source, just make sure that if you're quoting from that source, you're quoting it correctly and you're doing it in accordance to the Harvard referencing system, which is there at the bottom. And I'll talk more about Harvard referencing system a bit later as well, in case you're not sure what that system of referencing is. Okay, so the green arrows, I'm going to go through them. The one on the left, the writer here explains the philosophical idea and a major proponent of it. So like I said, they talk about free will and they talk about Jean-Paul Sartre. He is the major proponent. There could be a number of them, but they chose Jean-Paul Sartre. Notice the sources included in the sentences. You don't have to just put a source in there as like a separate sentence. The writer here, has included it within their sentence, and that's perfectly fine. If anything, that's encouraged. And the writer expands on the original philosophical idea. So not only are they just saying, oh, this is what free will is, and this person said this on free will, they're going more into detail. Well, how has somebody else developed it? So they've gone into about a person called Richard Taylor, who's discussed it further, who's taken the ideas of Sartre further, okay, in a different direction, but further, further nonetheless. It helps. It gives the reader, by the time we've read about Taylor and Sartre, it gives them a better understanding of what free will is. Sartre's Sartre's core understanding of free will, and then a little bit of a more complicated understanding of free will as well comes later down the line with Taylor. Okay, so it's quite a useful thing that they've done, because it shows your knowledge and understanding, thinking of that criteria C. The writer has added the details of the source here as a footnote. The details included are done according to the part of the Harvard referencing system, which I'll come to later. So their IA continues here. So at the top, they have continued to just sort of go through the ideas of Taylor that have expanded on the ideas of Sartre. Notice how the writer is showing their understanding of the idea and the potential issues. So even though you don't have to analyze it at this point just yet, the writer here is starting to analyze it. They're starting to look at the ideas and think, oh, well, this could be a problem. This might not make sense, and this is why it might not make sense. Or if this is true, then it raises this question further, which is a harder question to answer. Or, you know, and that kind of analysis can happen throughout. So the writer of this one has chosen to analyze a little bit early on, which is absolutely fine to do. Even though the writer is not directly using a quote, the point here is a point made by the person read from. This is why they reference them using the footnote below. So you don't have to use not everything you reference has to be a quote. If I say Karl Marx came up with his ideas about religion in the 19th century, and that's my sentence, I could reference that sentence and say, what book began his sort of musings on, his thoughts on religion, and then put that as like my source. How do I know that Marx started talking about religion in the 19th century? Because this book tells me so. So you can do it that way. You don't have to necessarily in the IA text, but again, when you get to university, that's something that you need to be quite familiar with. Is that if you're talking about an idea, but you're not necessarily taking an extract from it, you still should reference it nonetheless. It's just good practice. Okay, so I've just shown you again with the little red circles, just again how they've footnoted their ideas. So they've footnoted Richard Taylor. So that's just a good example of how it's done again. If you're doing this in Microsoft Word, it should automatically number. There's an option, I think it's at the top of the toolbar, it says references or something like that, and you click on that, and then you click on footnotes, insert footnotes, and it just inserts your little number, and it inserts a number at the bottom of the page, which you just write right next to the number, what it is that you're referring to. It should be quite straightforward, and it does it organizes it numerically for you, so you don't have to mess around with it so much. The first paragraph of the first part of the second sort of section of theirs, the arguments for determinism. The writer, having discussed their understanding of free will, then looks at alternative arguments. In this case, it's the arguments for determinism. So, thinking of the criteria knowledge and understanding, they are showing a good knowledge and understanding because they're showing that free will is not the only argument. There is determinism, and not only is just determinism a blanket sort of term for an idea, there are different kinds of determinism, and they're talking about biological determinism, hard determinism, soft determinism, social determinism, economic determinism. So they're showing quite a broad understanding of what those arguments could be that suggest to us that actually our life is determined. Okay, something to keep in your mind when writing your own. Similar structure. Who are the major proponents? What have they said? What does this mean? So the structure that they used in the free will section, they've used the same structure in determinism. Pretty good approach to do, because if the reader is used to the structure, then it makes it easy for them to understand. If you take on a completely different structure, it makes it a little bit more difficult for the reader to keep up. So don't be afraid to sort of mimic the structure. There's no problem in that so much. So I advise that you read it in your own time. You read these extracts of this example as we go along. Pause the video and just take time to read it, just so you can see just how the structure is being used, how are they using the references, and so on and so forth in their text. Okay, near the bottom, the writer overall is showing they understand the philosophical debate on the issue with the stimulus, on the issue that the stimulus could raise, beg your pardon. They are showing they understand why some say humans have free will, why some say we do not, and some who offer more intermediate suggestions. So again, they're showing a broad, encompassing understanding of the different arguments within the spectrum of free will or determinism. So, just reflecting on the criteria. So the one that flashed up before was the clarity. So again, like I was saying before, clarity runs right the way through from the first word to the last word, making sure that your work is clear. But knowledge and understanding is quite key in this part as well, because again, like I said earlier, it's important that you are following the structure. It's important that within that structure you are being very clear in expressing the ideas that you've said you're going to discuss in your introduction. You've said that you're going to discuss free will determinism, then you make sure that you convince the reader that you have done your research and that you fully understand free will and determinism, and the proponents of those dispositions. So in this case, you can judge. I'm not going to tell you what the mark was for knowledge understanding for this paper, but read it yourself and think: are they showing a good level of knowledge, or are they not? There's a well-developed explanation of the philosophical issue. You read it yourself and you judge: have they done a good job of explaining what free will determinism is, and the different sort of interpretations of those two arguments, or have they not? Okay, so I'll let you judge that one yourself. Just to come to the reference list, as you do your research, I would suggest that you keep your reference list as an ongoing thing. So the moment you find an extract that you think, oh, I might use that in my text, then make a note, write that extract down somewhere. I used to have, when I was at university many moons ago, I used to have a little booklet. I would be reading a booklet, reading a book or an article or whatever, and I would see a sentence, or I'd see two sentences and think, right, okay, I'm going to write those sentences down, which I would do, and then I would write the author, the page, the year it was published, the publisher, the title of the book, the chapter it was in, everything, all the details about where I'd found that extract, and then I'd do that just over time. After 6, 7, 8 weeks of me doing my research, eventually I'd have a booklet full of sources that I could use and all the information I could use. I might only have used half the extracts that I found, but it just made it so much easier to put those extracts in my text, rather than write a little bit and then go and do some research, write a little bit, go and do some research. That made it a little bit more difficult. That would be a bit more difficult, sorry. But the writing it down and keeping a sort of catalogue of extracts and the information for the reference list made it much easier to do when it came to writing the whole thing. It's standard practice that it's in alphabetical order. It doesn't have to be. Again, though, it's something at university it's quite stressed that you put in alphabetical order. It's just common practice. Notice a little bit as well. You can pause the video after this. That's what I'm done waffling on. Notice the difference between the web links and the book links, or the article links. These different information you've got to add. There's information on, when I was talking about the template earlier that we have in our school, there's information right at the very end of the template which gives you a website on how to use Harvard Referencing System, just to make sure that you've got the details to reference properly. So feel free to go back, or I'm going to come back to that template later down the line. Feel free to pause and write down that link and use it to do some research on how to Harvard reference yourself, just so you get it spot on when you're doing it yourself. Okay. So, how to transition from covering the philosophy to evaluating the idea. Like I said earlier, crucial part. What does analysis mean? What does evaluate mean? Well, we can't analyse and we can't evaluate if you don't know what they mean. An analysis is the careful investigation and scrutiny of a subject, topic, anything like that. Your analysis occurs throughout the IA, but predominantly where you begin to evaluate the philosophy in your discussion. A person who is analysing something does so by showing they have carefully reasoned, i.e. thought about, have considered its strengths and weaknesses, compared it with other similar or challenging ideas, and is prepared to make personal judgments about it. To evaluate means to assess and judge something based on the evidence, be it physical evidence or reasoning. This comes primarily towards the end of your IA, though some writers may choose to briefly evaluate ideas as they are discussed in their writing instead of doing it all at the end. A person evaluating something is judging how sensible it is, how applicable it is, how valid it is, how well supported it is, how agreeable it is, how helpful it is, and so on. They're making judgments. They're putting themselves out there and saying, well, this is what I think after the research I've done, after thinking about it long and hard, this is what I think. Okay? So, that analysis can come in your explanation of the initial idea, like the writer in the example before had done. And it can come later as well. So in the later section where it says what do other, in this template here, what do other philosophers say about Marx's philosophy, where you're coming up with alternative points of view, or people who have critiqued Marx or who have supported Marx in the case of this scenario, you can begin analysing there and you can begin evaluating there too. And the evaluation 2 comes at the end, and we'll come to that later down the line. So I'll put that in the orange, but the focus is the 2 red ones. It's those 2 sections really. So here in the example students IA, you can see that their analysis is quite clearly signposted with the heading, "Are we free or determined? Eliot's plight." And that indicates to the reader that the next section is going to be an interrogation and investigation into just how viable each argument is in order for a conclusion to be reached. So again, thinking about the criteria B, clarity, you using signposts like that, very useful to indicate that you know what you're talking about, that there is a structure that you've thought long and hard about, even though you haven't, you just followed my template. But it indicates that level of thought that you put in. So it's a good thing to do. So at the beginning of their discussion, the writer is reminding the reader of the stimulus's question: does Eliot, the person in the art, have free will or not? They do this by applying one of the ideas discussed. So they apply Darwin's idea about, are we biologically determined, to Eliot. Well, and they're testing it. It's a bit like in a science lab. You'd put, if you wanted to test the reactivity of a metal, you might put it in water, you might put it under fire, you might put it in acid, and then just look at the results and see. And that's kind of what's going on here. You're testing it in the same way. You're saying, well, if Darwin's right, then if we think about Darwin, if we think of Eliot in terms of Darwin and what Darwin suggests about humans, and their actions and how determined they are, then what does that mean for Eliot? And that's what the writer's doing here. They're testing it in a very similar way, like trial and error sort of thing. The next part, the writer is doing the same with another idea raised earlier. So they do the same thing with social determinism. They're applying that idea to Eliot. Does it help us understand Eliot's plight? Does it help us understand Eliot's actions? And does it help us understand free will or determinism as a whole? So it's important. It's an important thing to note that they're doing this. This is so that they can later in their writing make a comparison between the ideas as to which one offers a more sensible, reasonable, helpful answer. This shows a thorough analysis of the ideas to the reader. So they're not just testing one idea and going, "Yep, this is the one I think is right. Sod the others, I'm not looking at them." They've looked at they're trying to look at all the ideas expressed, testing them all, and then they're saying, which one suits the best. Again, a bit like a scientist, they might test different metals in different conditions and then say, okay, well, this one is the most reactive. Why? Because I tested it 3 times in 3 different scenarios and it reacted in every single one of them. So this one is the most reactive. So they're doing something similar. Instead of 3 metals, we've got 3 or 4 different ideas that they're testing on the stimulus and seeing actually which one does give us the most clarity and gives us the most insight into the issue that stimulus has raised. There's also no bias. Okay, so that's quite an important thing to note as well. They've not just talked about determinism, they've not just talked about free will, but they've talked about both, and they've analysed both. How valid are both? So the ideas discussed earlier, so the judgments they will make are ones that are valid. They even bring in further research showing their greater awareness on the ideas discussed. So earlier they hadn't talked about John Locke's tabula rasa, and they hadn't talked about that in terms of like free will. Like we have the freedom to sort of start our to put whatever we want in our life and fill our plate with whatever we want to by our actions. That hadn't been featured earlier, but they've chose to feature it later on as an expansion to the idea that perhaps we are the captains of our own life rather than we are determined, as earlier discussed. Notice too how the writer offers reasons as to why the idea might not be so strong, convincing and sensible. That's the evaluation coming in. So I pointed it out there earlier on in the text. Again, you don't have to evaluate it so early on. I mean, I say early on, it's like halfway through the text, but you don't have to evaluate it throughout the text. But in this case, the person who's writing has began to evaluate it. They began to say, well, I don't think this idea stands up, or I don't think this suggestion is helpful in clarifying the issue because, and they give reasons why. So I think it's good practice to do that, but it doesn't mean not doing that doesn't mean you won't score high marks. So I'll let you sort of pause the screen again. You can read through the extract, through the example that I've given, and you can judge: is it clear? Does it meet the criteria of 4 marks? Do you think? And is the knowledge understanding in the text too? Is it sound knowledge? Is it show sound understanding? Are they using the philosophical vocabulary correctly? And I'll let you judge reading it through yourself and see if it gets 4 out of 4 in that section too. Likewise, look at the analysis criteria. Look at the success criteria from the specification and read through it yourself, and then read through the the example yourself, and think: does it meet that top box? I'm not telling you if it did or not. I want you to sort of pause the screen and think to yourself: does that actually contain well-developed critical analysis? Do you think the examples used are well chosen, and do they lend support to the arguments? Are the counter arguments identified and analysed in a convincing way? I'll let you pause the screen, read through it yourself, and judge that for yourself. Same for evaluation. Look at the evaluation points. Where in this extract from the example, where is the writer saying, given their thoughts on the possibility of that suggestion of an answer? Where are they saying what they think about Darwin's biological determinism sort of point of view? Where are they talking about social determinism and how valid they think it is? Where are they doing that? And equally for the free will, where are they giving their sort of 2 cents about whether they think free will is a valid sort of perspective on Eliot's decisions, and does he have free will or not? And for the wider humanity, do we have free will? Are the arguments presented there convincing them, or are they, as a writer, not convinced? Where are they saying that in the text here? Okay, the last section, and then I'll give you some tips just to part ways on how to conclude it and bring it back to the stimulus. What is the purpose of conclusion? Before I go into the template and the example I gave, I just want you to understand exactly what the point of a conclusion is, because you might think from what you've read so far, well, haven't they done it? Haven't they done all the things they need to do? Well, yeah, they have to an extent, but conclusion is a good habit to get into, and I think it's a seal the deal. It's a cherry on the top of the cake sort of thing. A conclusion is the writer's chance to tie everything together. It's where they may offer their final judgments, final thoughts, assess their aims, which they lay out at the beginning of their discussion. And in the case of your IA, remind the reader that the discussion is concerning the questions, issues raised by the stimulus. It's easy to forget that you're actually writing about the stimulus, that the whole thing that triggered it is the question from the stimulus. So when you get 1,500, 600 words in, you're like, oh yeah, I forgot. And it's important that you remind the reader that that is what you're talking about. You're actually talking about how can we find an answer to the issue? Can we find some clarity? Can we get some quality insight from the ideas raised? Or are the ideas raised not or some of the ideas raised not good? Are they not helpful? Are they not well supported and such? So that's a conclusion in a nutshell. For example, just going back to what we were saying before about John Lennon's Imagine and such. Let's say our stimulus is a line from John Lennon's Imagine. Let's use the line we said before: imagine there's no heaven above us, only sky. The question arising being, is society better off without religion? And let's too pretend in our IA we've discussed Karl Marx's views on religion, the development of communism leading to the development of anti-religious rhetoric, then alternatives and Emile Durkheim praising the role of religion in society, and other more modern defenders of religion in society. Our conclusion may be on what we, the writer, think of Marx's ideas or communism's ideas, Durkheim's ideas, and so on. Which do we judge to be the most sensible of those ideas that we've raised? Reasonable, well supported, agreeable, and therefore, what does this mean for the question Lennon's song raises to us at the beginning? And that's how if using that example that I've been using throughout the video, that's how I'd structure a conclusion from the example that I've been raising. So that would naturally come as a conclusion at the end of your IA. It says 600 words. Now, that's up to you to judge, like I said before, more so than what I've been saying before, and I'll tell you why. Because, like I was saying earlier, when you've been doing your analysis and you've been like offering alternative points of view and you've been expressing them in your text, like the writer in the example has done, you might be evaluating right the way through it. In which case, you might not need a very long conclusion at all. Where you evaluate, you might have done enough evaluation earlier on. However, you might feel like you haven't actually evaluated too much. You might think by this point, I haven't actually given my point of view. I haven't actually said, well, why do I think that some of these ideas aren't tenable? Why don't they make sense? Why don't they give us clarity? Why don't they help us understand the issue? And if you've not done that, then this is the area to do it. But like I say, you might have done it earlier in the text. So if you have done it earlier in the text and you've done that a few times, then perhaps it can be 400 words maybe or fewer. Whereas if you haven't, you might want to give a bit more space to do that in. So you get, if you remember the criteria, 6 marks out of 25 on that area. So it's just something to be mindful of in your own writing. Okay, so the conclusion and the example I've given. I'm going to go for the first bit. So it says the writer begins with a judgment straight away regarding the stimulus's raised question, which they go on to elaborate on. The very first line is a short sentence, 10 words long roughly, and it gives us clearly their point of view, doesn't it? Straight off the bat. A very clear signpost again that they've got some structure. They know, as a writer, they've known that their evaluation is going to come at the end after their analysis, and that shows that quite clearly. The writer explains their thoughts on their judgments using the understanding of the ideas which they are offering as their chosen answer to the question. So they're not just giving their sort of shallow thoughts, they're actually giving the reader a good understanding of what they think and why they think it, for what the reasons are, and making it clear to the reader, what their judgments are. At some points like here, and the last sentence, they offer short, clear summaries of what they think on the issue. Remember, there are marks for clarity. Don't be afraid to use short sentences. A very big problem we have in particularly philosophy, but in sixth form, and you see it at university as well, is that people seem to have this mindset that, I am more sophisticated and I am more academic, therefore I must use bigger sentences. No, some of the most iconic lines that you'll ever know from a philosopher, a scientist, a writer, whatever, will be short lines. You can say a lot more with fewer words sometimes, and in this case they've done that. So just keep that in mind. The writer even adds a last bit of research that supports their judgments. In this case, research on the spawn, I should say. It's been a long day, hasn't it? On the spawn of Holocaust. Spawn? Should I use spawn? I'll let you decide that one. You can let me know. On the spawn of Holocaust survivors inheriting trauma, meaning there is evidence that humans in life are somewhat determined. So, just because you're near the end of your IA doesn't mean that you can't include further research. If anything, it's quite encouraged, because again, it's a good way of showing that your research is extensive. I hope that, having read the earlier parts of the example IA here, that you've got a sense that the writer has done their research, and hopefully them adding 1,700, 600 words or 800 words in to their IA, they're adding even more research that they've done. I think that's a good way of showing the examiner, yeah, I've done my homework. I'm clued up on this. I know what I'm doing. I've got my evaluations, and here's why. So that's a good thing to do. You don't have to, but if you can, why not? So just as a final thing, there's the criteria for your analysis, for your evaluation, and for your clarity. So that if you looking at the extract from the example, again, read it yourself. You might want to go a bit earlier in the video so you can get the last sentence, because I've cropped it out here by mistake. You might want to just read that and judge yourself. Have they continued to analyse? Have they really thought? Is it evidential that they've thought about the validity and the reasonability and applicability of the ideas raised? Have they cast their judgments? Have they evaluated? Have they come forward and said, this is what I think and why, and is it clear? Have they done that, you know, with good spelling, punctuation, grammar, syntax, sentence structure, and so on. And then, you know, you can give them a mark yourself and think, well, what did they get? They're not, you know, just to assume that they're all top marks isn't right. So don't assume that this IA is a perfect one, because it's not perfect. It's a very good one, but it's not perfect. So, you know, don't make the assumption that it has got perfect marks on all the criteria. So, you know, don't be afraid to be a bit critical yourself when reading it and think, okay, I could do that better, or this is how it could be better and such. So be mindful of that. Okay, so there's all the criteria. Just to remind you, and like I said before, out of 25 marks. Final tips. So things I want you to stop watching this video and keep thinking about. I want you to do your research. You know, as it's the most boring part, but it's the most important part. It's really vital. On your chosen stimulus, look at the big philosophical issue or question raised by it, and then research it. In the example, the writer identified free will and determinism as the issue, and they researched the ideas of Sartre, Taylor, Darwin, Hume. It went on, didn't it, to form their discussion. So make sure you do that. And like I said earlier, make sure you write down your ideas. Keep a record of sources, perhaps a Word document where you keep a bullet point list of extracts, quotes you think will be useful to include, and the information for you to reference them. So like I said earlier, I at university kept a little book and wrote them down myself with all the information I would need to create my reference list. At the very end, didn't even use half the extracts. You know, when I did my dissertation at the end of university, I must have written about 50, 60 extracts. Only used about 20, 30 of them, binned off the other 30. So, you know, that was a lot of hours wasted, but it's important you do that. It's important that you give yourself that preparation to help you really get stuck into your writing. If you get a list of 20 extracts and only use 10 of them, that's fine. Keep record of them. Will make writing it easier. Another tip, don't worry about the word count. Now, I said right at the beginning it's got to be between 1,900 and 2,100 words. That doesn't matter. That's something for right at the end. Hopefully your tutor can help you with that. But you know, don't worry about it. If your IA you complete one draft and it's 2,800 words, it's not a problem. If you complete your draft and it's 1,500 words, you know, it's not a problem. It is if you submit it that way, but you know, as a draft, it's not a problem. So just don't worry about it at all until the end. It's way more important that you focus on what you're writing, your clarity, your structure, your research, how you include your research. That should be more of your focus for the most part of writing it. Follow a structure. You don't have to follow the structure that I put in my examples. Some of the best IAs that you can read, or you probably would see that got high marks, probably haven't followed a strict structure. But to say that it has no structure would be wrong. That the writer will have had their own structure. So if you have your own sort of idea of a structure that you'd like to use for your IA, then go ahead and use it. But if not, and you're a bit dumbfounded on how to structure your own IA, then you can just look at the template I've given and follow that structure if that helps you. And the last tip, go back. Don't be afraid to look back. If you've researched something a few days ago or whatever, and then you've forgotten it or you don't remember it very well, don't assume that, well, tough, I read it, I watched that video, I'm not doing it again. I get it, sort of thing. Be honest with yourself. If you watch something for 10 minutes and didn't get it, go back again and watch it again. If you just read 2 paragraphs or something and thought, what the hell did that say? I didn't get any of that. Read it again. You know, don't be afraid to do that. And perhaps do it differently. Why don't you highlight it this time? Why don't you read a sentence at a time and pause long between sentences? Why don't you, you know, if there's words in there that you don't understand and you just sort of read around them thinking, oh, I'll just understand the rest of the sentence. No, pick out those words that you don't understand, then go and find out what those words are, and then read the sentence again with your understanding of that word now in the sentence. So just don't be afraid to watch things again, to read things again. It's common for an academic who's writing to have read over there if they've done some research and repeated research, just so they are certain in themselves that they understand the ideas clearly. Because if you're writing your IA about something that you don't understand, it'll become quite obvious to the reader and to the examiner particularly that you don't know what you're on about. So make sure that you look back and you give yourself time to really grasp the ideas that you're looking at, and your writing will be better for it. You'll be able to articulate your words, articulate your thoughts, and express yourself in a better way, having got a better understanding of it. So not only will you get better marks for your knowledge and understanding, but you'll get better marks for your clarity and structure as well. So think about those things as well that we talked about in terms of your criteria. Okay, so that's it for me. I hope it helps. My last little helpful slide for you to have is this lady from The Voice. I don't know who she is. I've never had a Dunkin' Donuts drink. Someone can tell me if a Dunkin' Donuts drink is that different to any other drink? Is it a Coke? I don't really know. But yeah, I'm rooting for you. Yeah, I'm rooting for you. I hope you do well. Share information like I have. If you've got any tips you can offer, share them. If you've got any insights, share them. And don't be afraid to speak out if you've got any problems and that sort of thing. Don't put your head in the sand and think it'll go away. Speak out and find solutions to your problems that you've got. All right? Thank you very much.